I can just in the next in this section I am actually going to look at ventilation, including gaseous exchange, and so I'm going to look at okay, this is the resp. So the 4 types of respiration that occur in the human body, starting with pulmonary respiration, internal and external respiration, and the transport of gases. So I think the first, it's much easier to just say breathing is a process that's controlled in the human body. It is controlled centrally by the respiratory centers, which are found in the pons and in the medulla. So if we were to look at the brainstem, we'd find the pons there and the medulla just inferior to it. So in the pons, there are 2 types of respiratory center. However, the inhalation and the exhalation centers are located, like this is the, I'm so sorry, there's a massive truck passing outside. However, this is the inspiration and expiration centers, and they are both in the medulla. So they are under the control of 2 nerves, really, the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is the cranial nerve number 9. I don't know why I wrote that. Cranial nerve number 9, and the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve number 10. So what happens is there are 2 main ways, really. We divide the control of respiration into 2 main parts, which is the neuronal control, which is mainly under, facilitated by the cranial nerves. Obviously the impulse going into the nerves, and they giving the efferent motor feedback. So this is basically based on the J receptors, which sense hypoxia, and when they sense hypoxia, they stimulate cranial nerve 9, and that then goes on to activate the inspiration centers and cause a person, whoever is, has low oxygen, to then it drives their inspiratory drive and causes them to inhale and take in oxygen in order to correct the state of hypoxia. We then also have the stretch receptors, and the stretch receptors are actually located in the lungs. And what happens with the stretch receptors is that obviously we know that the lungs expand and contract. They are elastic by nature. And as we are breathing in, particularly as we are inhaling air, we cause our lungs to expand. And as lungs expand, they touch the thoracic cage and activate the stretch receptors. And the stretch receptors then activate again the inspiratory center, the respiratory centers, and sort of say, stop stretching. They basically, the feedback they give is to inhibit that stretch of the lungs, and inhibiting the stretching will then, by that process, naturally activate exhalation. I'm obviously missing out a lot of steps of how all of this happens, but really it's via neuronal control. Neurons synapsing and giving out the motor control. So as we inhibit inspiration and causing stopping the expansion of lungs, we then exhale. And this is under the control of a mechanism, of a reflex mechanism called the Herring-Brouwer reflex. And this reflex, really all it does is to stop the overstretching of the lungs. So it's to inhibit, stretch via cranial nerve, via the vagus nerve, so via the cranial nerve 10. And then we also have receptors in the muscles. And the receptors in the muscles, all they do is, as say one is exercising and exerting themselves and obviously going into a higher metabolic state, they are increasing their carbon dioxide and also increasing their oxygen demand. And as that happens, it also sends impulses to the respiratory centers to say, we need to correct this process there and sort of meet the body's metabolic needs. And as that happens, again, under the glossopharyngeal nerve, it causes increased respiratory rate, so it will increase the rate of respiration, which and also increase the force of respiration. So again, as we do that, it means that we're, breathing quicker, inhaling and exhaling much, much quicker than we normally do in order to try and get rid of the carbon dioxide and take in more oxygen and return the body and meet the body's metabolic demands. There is also the chemical control. And the chemical control is based on sensing the hypoxia and also sensing hypercapnia, and sensing reduced pH, which means we have high hydrogen ions. So sensing of hypoxia, again, all of this is controlled by the respiratory center, the medullary center. Again, so if one has low oxygen, again, the medulla is stimulated to activate inspiration and expiration, so increasing the breathing rate so that, that the state of hypoxia is corrected. Again, if the pH is low, the same thing happens, but obviously in terms of being opposite. We also have baroreceptors. And the baroreceptors, if we remember, we've already discussed them in cardiology. They are located in the carotid bodies and in the aortic arc. And again, all they do is to sense that there is low oxygen, that the partial pressure of oxygen is less than 8. So when the partial pressure of oxygen is reduced, the carotid bodies in the aortic arc and the aortic arc baroreceptors will sense that and send a signal again to say, there is low pressure of oxygen, make the body take in more oxygen And again, it happens in a similar way, really, in terms of stimulating the respiratory centers. So now that I've briefly covered how the central control actually happens, the next section is just to quickly look at actually what happens in the lungs. I'll start big by what happens in the lungs and then move on to the smaller airways. So in the lungs, if we can remember from the first introductory lecture of anatomy, I talked about that there are ribs in the lung, that the lung has ribs and diaphragm, which are the two muscles for normal respiration. So these are ribs, and in between ribs we have intercostal muscles. So the diaphragm and intercostal muscles are also under control of the respiratory center, as I've talked about that. But when we breathe, in terms of the pressures and in terms of how oxygen and carbon dioxide is exchanged in the nose and the lungs, when the intercostal pressures are stimulated to contract together with the diaphragm, again, stimulated to contract. Remember, when the diaphragm contracts, it actually relaxes. And so if we were to look at the diaphragm in terms of, this is the diaphragm, this is the thoracic cage. So we can see that a diaphragm that's relaxed is actually extending into the thoracic cavity itself. So which means that there is a very small volume. That volume there is actually small volume. Oh gosh, I cannot spell sometimes. Small volume. And when a volume is small, it means that the gases in there are under enormous pressure. So then the opposite happens when the diaphragm relaxes. It does that. I'm obviously making this really simplified. It reduces, so an increased volume will reduce pressure. And a similar thing happens with the ribs. Remember, when the intercostal muscles contract, they actually lift the ribs up and away. They will lift the ribs up and away, increasing the volume of the thoracic cavity. So the contraction of both the intercostal muscles and diaphragm both of these two cause the volume of the lungs to increase and the pressure inside the lungs to reduce. So when I talk about pressures, we are relating all these pressures in the lungs to the atmospheric pressure, which is around 760 millimolecules per mercury. So this atmospheric pressure is rich in oxygen, and it has low CO2. So normally the intercostal pressure is assumed to be equal to the atmospheric pressure, really, in order to sort of explain gaseous exchange. So if we're to say, okay, we're starting at an equilibrium, all the pressures inside our lungs and the atmospheric pressure are all equal, so they are directly proportional, lung and atmosphere. And then as the diaphragm contracts, and the intercostal muscles contract as well. They both lift the rib cage away and up, and that action obviously increases the volume of the lungs, but however it reduces the pressure. So say if this pressure is to be reduced to, I don't know, I'm just going to pick 500 millimoles per mercury. So if that pressure has been reduced to that much, then surely these gases, you know, by definition, gases naturally move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So by reducing the pressure and increasing the volume, we naturally cause the gases, the oxygen and the carbon dioxide, to move into our lungs, that's through the nose. And because the atmospheric air has a lower amount of carbon dioxide, and our lungs, as we need to expel the carbon dioxide, so it's rich in CO2 and low in O2. So really all that happens is we take in that air, and as we relax, we take out what is rich in there, which is the CO2. So as this changes into the relaxation phase, the volume reduces and the pressure in there of the carbon dioxide in our lungs increases. The carbon dioxide naturally diffuses out and we exhale. So this is what happens in what we call the pulmonary gaseous exchange, or pulmonary respiration really, on a much larger surface. And then we go on to looking at the external respiration. And the external respiration really focuses on gaseous exchange in the alveolar and gaseous exchange in the tissues. So this is divided into two, into external respiration and internal respiration, and also the transport of gases. So if we're to start with the alveoli, you know, we know that I have covered the alveoli a bit. So if we just start with one alveoli, the alveoli is the perfect place for gaseous exchange because its surface there is only made up of a single layer. So like one layer, this is number one, a single layer of type 1 pneumocytes. It also, obviously, type 1 pneumocytes are just the epithelial cells. So it also has type 2, while I'm talking about these pneumocytes, I might as well as mention type 2 pneumocytes, which secretes a lung surfactant. And type 2 as well are progenitors for type 1. So if we, you know, if anything happens, type 2 will just develop into type 1 and make up for type 1 in order to correct any deficiencies or any cell death, you know, either by natural apoptosis that happens to type 1 cells. So then so we have those two types of cells. The alveoli obviously is located at the terminal bronchiole. So we'll have our terminal bronchiole there. This is all part of a sac. And there will be obviously the alveolar duct. Making all of these into one sac. And one bunch of like that. I think I drew this in the other recording. So if all of these are if this entire thing is the alveolar sac, and one of these is an alveoli, and this will be the terminal bronchiole leading into these alveoli. Oh, I can't really draw it properly, but then this is the alveolar duct. So it's made up, the alveolus is made up of a single layer of type 1 pneumocytes, which means that it has a very thin surface there to allow, the membrane that is close to the capillary there is quite thin, and its thinness allows for easy transfer of gases between the alveolar and between the alveolar and the capillary. So the capillary, again, if we were to go back to cardiology, we'll remember that venous return arrives from the heart into the lung via the pulmonary artery. And this is blood that has a high CO2 and low oxygen. As in, when I say high, I mean the partial pressure for carbon dioxide is much higher than that of oxygen. And it enters the capillary. And if we can remember, the alveoli, like most tissues in the body, will have a capillary network, will be overlaid by the alveolar sac, will be overlaid by a capillary network. And obviously a capillary network is made up of venules and arterioles, so it brings blood from the venous return. Or actually, in the alveoli, the alveoli is completely opposite to the tissues, as in the tissues we'll have the arteriole bringing in oxygen-rich blood and the venule taking carbon dioxide-rich blood away. However, in the pulmonary system, in the alveoli, we'll have the arteriole bringing in carbon dioxide-rich blood from the right ventricle. And because all these capillaries overlay the alveolar sac. So this is what we're looking at now. This is I've just taken this one tiny alveoli and magnified it into this. So now we're just looking at one alveoli and the pulmonary arteriole coming in with carbon dioxide rich blood. And if we remember from what I've just talked about in terms of us breathing in oxygen-rich air, so it means that inside the alveoli itself, we have the partial pressure for oxygen is actually high, and that of carbon dioxide is actually really, really low. So because of that, as this blood moves into the capillary, it comes in closer to the alveoli, like the alveolar membrane there. Gases will naturally want to go to an area where their pressure is actually low. So but naturally, carbon dioxide and O2, naturally gases exchange will happen. Carbon dioxide will diffuse into the alveoli, and oxygen will diffuse into the capillary, and it will be carried into the pulmonary vein and into the pulmonary vein and the left atrium. So it will go into the pulmonary vein and the left atrium of the heart, and then through the mitral valve into the left ventricle and through the aortic arc into the whole body. And this is how really blood then gets distributed throughout the body. And internal respiration really is, if we change this from being an alveolar and say this was a tissue, so this is now any tissue in the body really. So this is a tissue that's undergoing metabolic processes, and in undergoing metabolic processes it's using up all of its oxygen. So it has very low oxygen pressure, partial pressure of oxygen is really low. However, it's giving off carbon dioxide as the waste material, and this partial pressure for carbon dioxide is really, really high. So as this capillary, which overlays this tissue, receives its perfusion from the right ventricle, so now we have blood from the right ventricle arriving here. And this blood from the right ventricle, remember this is blood that's coming from the lungs, coming from the alveolar process that I just talked about. So this blood has a high oxygen partial pressure and a very low carbon dioxide partial pressure. And as it comes in here, so this is high, low, and this is high. Oxygen, carbon dioxide will naturally diffuse, will naturally move from the capillary carbon dioxide will naturally move from the tissue is up here now, into the capillary, and oxygen will move from the capillary into the tissue to meet the body's oxygen demands. And then we'll have carbon dioxide rich blood, CO2 rich blood, which is low in O2, returning into the venous system and back into the right atrium, into through the tricuspid valve, into the right ventricle, through the pulmonary valve, and into the right, oh no, it's not even right, into the pulmonary artery. And we go back to the lungs. So this is the process for gaseous exchange, the internal and external gaseous exchange. Now we need to talk about the actual transport of these gases. How do they move? How does it happen? Obviously, it's easy to think about it as in simple diffusion or simple movement, but they actually move in the tissues. They are transported by hemoglobin, and also by changing their structures. And by changing structures, I'm specifically referring to carbon dioxide, which is transported, carbon dioxide is transported via like simple diffusion. But this is very little carbon dioxide that's transported in this way. This is just like CO2, simple diffusion. Carbon dioxide is also mostly, it can also be transported by hemoglobin. Again, this is not a lot. This is only 23% of carbon dioxide is carried by hemoglobin. So most of the carbon dioxide really is transported via the carbonic acid, bicarbonate system, shall we say. So what happens is we have, say if we have carbon dioxide in a tissue, it will naturally, because it will naturally react with water to form carbonic acid, and that carbonic acid, as it reaches, so in the plasma, it dissociates into bicarbonates and hydrogen molecules, and this happens under carbonic anhydrase enzyme. So this enzyme is readily available, and this is why this system actually transports 70% of the carbon dioxide. And because it's readily available, this is the most efficient way of transporting carbon dioxide in the body. And the most important thing to remember is that, you know, all the carbon dioxide that's there is immediately converted by this enzyme. This enzyme overrides, as in it's much more dominant to these other two mechanisms. It just overrides everything, takes all the carbon dioxide, converts it into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions, and this is how carbon dioxide is transported. And if we're to remember, low pH, as in hypercapnia, if we go back to the hypercapnia state, which I talked about, is obviously based on having low pH, which means we have a high number of hydrogen ions, and as hydrogen ions increase due to the high carbon dioxide that we have, we also then need to, I'm just going to link this with how respiratory drive also occurs. So as hydrogen ions accumulate in the body, the pH will reduce, and the pH is reducing because of obviously the high carbon dioxide that we have. So what happens is we need that carbon dioxide to activate the respiratory center system that is based on hypercapnia. So and it's based on hypercapnia because of low pH, and because things like hydrogen ions cannot cross. Remember, the respiratory center is actually in the brain, in the medulla, the chemoreceptor. So as these hydrogen ions actually increase and we have a low pH, the respiratory center needs to be activated. However, the way it activates the respiratory center is by carbon dioxide diffusing through the brain blood barrier and through the blood CSF barrier. And when carbon dioxide diffuses into these barriers, it undertakes this part of the equation, becomes carbonic acid, which obviously also has a low, which obviously also reduces the pH because it's high in hydrogen ions, and as that reduction in pH then manages to activate the respiratory drive. And obviously this part of the respiratory drive that's driven by hypercapnia is much more important in people who have sleep apnea, and also people who have COPD, particularly in terms of the treatment that people with COPD receive, because treatment is based on the respiratory drive, on trying to manage the respiratory drive. So if this respiratory drive is overcorrected, then it overrides the mechanism that really should be helping these people. So this is the important point that I just wanted to fit in about the respiratory drive and the transport of carbon dioxide, and how carbon dioxide